question, okay? So let me read the passage. So Acts 18, verses 12 to 17. But while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, "This man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a wrongdoing or a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there is any question about words and names in your own law, see to it yourselves. I am not willing to be judge over these matters." And he drove them away from the judgment seat. And they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. But Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So this passage kind of zooms in. For those who have been part of the study for a while now, will be aware that the way that Luke tends to write this particular historical account is he zooms out to a broader detail, right, actually giving the broader historical setting, and then usually zooms in on a particular instance of note. The passage from the last lesson, which was the first 11 verses, is very much the big picture view. He's covering a period of about a year and a half or 18 months in that span. So he zooms out to the big picture, gets the Cliff Notes version, so it were, and then zooms in on something that's of particular historical note, and this is one of those examples, now zooming back in. And it's around this particular persecutory action on the part of the Jews in Corinth. And so let's begin in verse 12. But while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, so the Roman province of Achaia covered what's called the Peloponnese in Greece, so southern Greece. Achaia was really a region of the northern Peloponnese as far as Greece was concerned, but this was the Roman province of Achaia, which covered this portion of Greece, including Corinth. Gallio was, according to Roman historical records, was in this case proconsul of Achaia from 51 to 52 AD. Which is why when someone, I forget who it was either you or it was Costa, who asked me how did we know when the expulsion with regards to Claudius had occurred, when Claudius, as emperor of the Romans, expels the Jews from Rome. It's tied into other, as I said, primary evidence. In this case, the Roman records of who was proconsul of Corinth at that time, namely Gallio. So we're in the time frame of around 52-ish AD, roughly.
My note here says that a fragmented stone found at Delphi
that's it.
has part of a letter from Emperor Claudius to Gallio, my friend. Claudius reigned from 41 to 54 AD.
That's what I'm referencing, yeah. So the primary source for Roman records is the Delphi script, yeah. And so it's during that time, that's how we can date these kinds of things. Internal evidence from the scriptures, and then which are a historical record in their own right, and then external evidence like that. And so during that time, the Jews rose up with one accord against Paul in Corinth and brought him to the judgment seat, right? So brought him to, in this case, Gallio as proconsul, as magistrate, as a civil authority in the city of Corinth. And their charge, their complaint was in verse 13 that this man, is in reference to the Apostle Paul, this man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. Now there's different literary or theological positions as to what law that's referring to. It can refer to one or really can probably actually refer to both. Are they complaining that Paul is, again, forgetting the actual truthfulness of the claim, just in terms of dissecting what the claim is, are they making a charge of Paul violating biblical law, right? So Old Testament law, or are they making a claim that he is violating Roman law? So what that would mean is to persuade men to worship God contrary to the law. Their charge would be, in that case, if it's regarding the Old Testament scriptures, that Paul is leading them astray. He is teaching heresy. He's teaching men to abandon God as opposed to draw closer to God, so on and so forth. This is something we've seen from them before throughout the book of Acts. it's an erroneous claim, which I've dispelled many times before when it's come up, but I'll touch on it in a minute. On the other side of the equation, they could be arguing that he is violating Roman law. So in the Roman Empire, only what were called religio licita, or legal religions, were the ones that were acceptable. So you had to have permission to practice a given particular religion. We've explained this in previous lessons, especially earlier on, that, as well as in our church history classes, that the habit or the custom, the geopolitical practice of the Roman Empire was that when they would move into a given territory and conquer it, intelligently, in order to quell rebellion and uprising against them, they would allow as much local customs, including religion, to remain in place as possible, including language, economics, politics, religion, etc. As long as you then assented to certain principles, like the fact that the emperor is supreme, like the fact that the Roman gods are up here, quote unquote, and yours are down here. And especially in this case, the people who had the most kind of leeway, as it were, in the empire were the Jews, right? Those in Judea, in the Roman province of Judea. Now, at this particular time, as I've also explained before, the distinction on the part of Rome politically between Jews and Christians was not distinct yet. It's quite early on in that process. So the Romans, throughout the bulk of the first century, not all, but certainly at this point in the early 50s, hadn't made the distinction between the Jews and the Christians in any meaningful sense, especially because early on at this point, a big bulk of the Christians are actually ethnically Jewish at the same time. So the distinction is not terribly obvious. After the second missionary journey, the distinction becomes way more obvious because you have a massive influx of Greeks particularly, but other what are called Gentiles, so other non-Jewish people, into the church. So it could be either according to biblical law, as they claim, or it could be according to Roman law, or it actually could just be both. You have a point, yeah?
I think it's very specific what Luke is getting
I do too, but yeah.
And I think the point of distinction at this time between the Jews and the early Christians who are Jews is a certain person
Correct.
named Jesus Christ.
Yeah, correct.
That is the distinction. That is the point of argument. And I think what the Jews were doing is that having rejected Christ as the Messiah,
and very
having
clear.
rejected Christ as God,
In the flesh, yeah.
they then go to the Roman authorities and say this personage is being worshipped as the alternative to Caesar.
That's where I was going to be getting to as well. Yeah, correct. So the where I would land on it is the reason why it can functionally be both is because their fundamental charge is really against the person of Christ himself. Okay. We've already seen them on more than one occasion, including up further north in Greece, raise the exact same point to the magistrates there, which is that these men, as in Paul and the Christians and co, are saying that there is another king other than Caesar. Okay. And really, at the end of the day, that was the fundamental thing that was taken, the thing with which umbrage was taken, so it were. That's the fundamental problem that both the Romans had, and ironically also the Jews, that there was another king being proclaimed who was not Caesar. Because we've explained plenty that in this time period in history, the Jews are utterly sold out to the Roman Empire. They're very much in consult and in league with them. That's evident through every single bit of historical record, biblical and even Roman as well. The Herodian dynasty, which is still just on the throne at this point in the 50s. The last Herodian king, Agrippa II, is still on the throne here. The way in which they are, and we've seen them conspire with local authorities to try and, in many cases, kill Paul and the Christians, in which they, for example, in Derbe, back over in Anatolia, stoned him and beat him within an inch of his life. And they are attempting to again try the same kind of thing here. It's the repeated pattern that we've seen from those who were in enmity to Christ as the particular specific focal point. Does that make sense? Their main gripe, their main anger is not even necessarily with Paul per se, because their main anger and gripe is actually with the Messiah who they've already rejected. And we've seen throughout the consequences that that's actually brought. The response, though, is actually a righteous response on the part of Gallio, the Roman proconsul. So if we keep reading through verse 14. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, so he was about to make a defence, as a highly educated man, again educated in the Greek educational system in Tarsus, he was a Roman citizen. He was an exceptionally talented rabbi in his own right, a teacher. He goes to make a defence, but Gallio kind of cuts in, interjects, and says in verse 14, if it were a wrongdoing or a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you, right? So if you brought me, the body of the man he just murdered in broad daylight, then I would be taking action. But verse 15, if there are questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves, because I'm not willing to be a judge in these matters. Now this will tie in, one of the points to draw here will tie into the big picture point that I'll make at the end of the lesson. But at least on the prima facie level, on the face value of it, there is righteousness occurring here on the part of Gallio. He's not willing to just throw standards of justice out the window. The Romans committed many atrocities. The Romans still also had a standard of justice which surpassed many in their own day. They actually did, on a meaningful level, care about order and principles of jurisprudence. Especially in this case where, in this particular example, he's not willing to prosecute Paul for the crime of basically nothing. This does a couple of things. One, it's a condemnation against the Jews who are trying to basically hijack the legal system in order to try and get their way. Instead of actually just simply taking Paul behind the proverbial barn shed and doing him over, like they've attempted to do elsewhere, they're trying to co-opt the legal system to give it an air of reasonableness, maybe would be the word. An air of legitimacy is probably a better way of saying it. And so they're trying to do that, but it's not working for them by virtue of the fact that Gallio is not willing to prosecute Paul for something that is maybe customary with regards to the Jews, for example. That's why his whole point is about questions about words and names in your own. Well, that's essentially what he's getting at. Yep.
It says that Paul opened his mouth. Mm-hmm. What do you think Paul was going to say?
I think...
Before you answer that...
Yeah, go ahead.
We already agreed in the last lesson that Paul had washed his hands of the unbelieving Jews.
Yep.
In fact...
Correct.
If we go back to around verse 6, it says,
It's
your
right,
blood is upon your head. I am clean from this. So he's done with them.
Yep.
So if he's done with them, he's not going to preach to them any longer, is he?
No.
So what was he going to say?
Yeah, look, it's a what if, but I think the logical conclusion is it was a legal defence that he was about to mount to Gallio. So it's similar to what the reason why I would say that is because I would take not that we're up to it yet, when we start getting into the later chapters in the mid to late 20s of this book, that's where we then see eventually the trial that does lead to Paul's condemnation. And when we get there, you'll see very clearly that it's a complete kangaroo court. It was completely contrived. There was no reasonable legal prosecutorial actions taken. It was a bunch of power-hungry men in a room screaming like baboons in a zoo. And Paul basically just dismantles the entire thing philosophically and theologically and demonstrates the complete legal corruption of the whole proceeding. I would argue that not that he would have done on that level, because this is not a kangaroo court in this essence, but I would suspect he was about to mount a reasonable philosophical defence of how he's not actually violated Roman law, that nothing he's done has contradicted it, and that more importantly, that there is the stance of, and that again, now we're well into the realms of what if, because that would depend on what Gallio's response would be, and so that would just be too speculative at that point. But yeah,
you think it was going to be a civil argument, not a theological argument?
Oh, I think. Well, that's why the what if of how that would play out is too speculative to say, because it would depend on what kind of response it got. I think there would be a blend of civil and theological argument. Yeah, but it's a what if, because the whole thing got interjected because Gallio actually upheld righteousness.
He opened his mouth and it got shut.
Yeah, basically, yeah, correct. Yeah, because basically it was you don't need to defend yourself because I'm going to get Gallio to do it for you. And so he upholds a reasonable standard of justice. If he's actually committed some grave wrongdoing or some vicious crime, right? He's murdered someone, he's theft, blah blah blah. Then it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. In other words, it would be reasonable to take your claim or your charge as legitimate. But if it's a question about your own words, your own laws, your own customs, etc., you deal with it. And so then he drives him away from the judgment seat, right? He basically dismisses it before it gets through disclosure as a process.
By the way, this is almost the same thing that happened at Jesus' trial.
Very reflective. Yeah, that's one of the bigger points I'm going to make as we get through the text. Yeah, and so what then occurs is, as a result of that, is quite fascinating. So there's a couple of principles here that, again, to remember by the time we get through to the end. The Roman proconsul, the pagan, righteously upholds justice as far as objective morality is concerned. Okay, so keep a pin in that idea and remember that. What happens then in verse 17 is where we then start to get into the meatier weight of the points that are drawn from this kind of text. So in verse 17, and they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and they in this context, by the way, sorry, is the Jews, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. But Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. So let's dissect a number of points here. The first question is regarding this Sosthenes. One point I'll address now, one point I'll address at the end. A common misreading, and this occurs because of usually short-term memory when people are reading through the passage. In verse 17, it refers to Luke explicitly recounts or records Sosthenes as the leader of the synagogue. Now, someone who's reading through the passage in real time will note that earlier up in verse 8, Crispus is referred to as the leader of the synagogue. And so sometimes the questions that I've had put to me is, well, is this contradictory? Because it's earlier up in the passage it says that Crispus is the leader, but now here it's saying that some other fellow called Sosthenes is the leader. So what's the deal there? This is why context is important, right? What happens to Crispus up in those early chapters, verses like verses 8, 9, and 10? Well, he converts to Christianity. Okay, so in other words, he's not the leader of the synagogue anymore. So Sosthenes is his replacement. Okay, that makes sense?
My commentary says yes.
Yes, exactly. Yes, his replacement, as in the replacement of Crispus, is Sosthenes. That should be taken and understood in account. What then happens is the question then comes with, well, why on earth are they beating him up? The logical flow would seem to argue that, in light of the rest of what we've seen throughout these verses 12 through 17, they are beating him because they are enraged that essentially their leader didn't actually achieve what they probably set out to achieve. Again, they didn't just decide one morning, you know what, why don't we go and see Gallio and see what he has to say about the matter. Like, this would have been, again, after 18 months now. You've got to remember that, well, we're not sure which portion of the 18 months it is, but long story short, in this 18-month period, this has been going on and on and on. They've already had their previous leader Crispus convert to Christianity, and so now their own leader in the synagogue has actually now converted and now actually does believe in the Messiah. So they would already be greatly annoyed and angered about that. They're now gone all the way to the length of, well, let's try and get the Roman magistrate involved. They may well have heard that others around the Eastern Mediterranean had already tried that tactic and almost had successes with it, potentially. And so they attempt to do it, again, as a planned, coordinated strategy, I suppose you could say, in order to silence the proclamation of the gospel, in order to silence and to try and destroy the work of God. Instead, it fails and backfires. They get embarrassed publicly because the Roman proconsul, as far as they would be concerned, just sided with the Christians, which is only true by virtue of the fact that Gallio actually sided with the truth, which is also the side that the Christians are on, because the truth is objective, which is why you can have both the Christians and the Roman proconsuls, who in this case at this point are pagan, who are enemies, actually being on the same side because of the fact that truth is objective. Two completely different people can actually come and arrive at the same point. And so they're greatly embarrassed publicly. This strategy has utterly failed and backfired. And so they turn on the guy that they probably had appointed as, Crispus abandoned us to the Christians. We need someone who's going to lead the charge and strike back. That would have been all boiling up over the months and months since the conversion of Crispus, who was the leader of the synagogue. And then the guy who they'd appointed to lead the charge against the Christians has now utterly failed. The plan was probably his in the first place, more likely than not. At least he would have been one of the people who came up with the plan as leader of the synagogue. And he would have led them all the way into the public square, and it's failed. And so then they absolutely beat him up. Now, why is this important? Not just simply the fact that it shows you the unbridled anger and just, quite frankly, the evil on the part of the apostate Jews who have rejected Christ as their Messiah. And a sentiment which has unfortunately continued its way down in all too many fashions throughout history. Here, they utterly turn in a rather publicly uncivilized and barbarous fashion upon their own leader. Now, what I want to point out, if you want to flick over to 1 Corinthians for me, which is relevant, obviously, by virtue of the fact that we're in Corinth, I'm going to show you two particular things. So the very first chapter of 1 Corinthians. So as you're turning there, it's customary for Paul in his epistles, the Apostle Paul in his epistles, to begin with an introduction and an exhortation. They used to say an encouragement. He also at times often finishes that way as well, but it's common to begin that way in his introduction with an exhortation or an encouragement to whomever he's writing. If you look down at verse 14 of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, so verse 14, this is part of a broader theological point he's making, which is not what I'm touching. I'm just wanting to get the reference so that you see it. In verse 14, he says, "I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius." Again, what that means and that contextually is a whole different issue. But I just want you to pick up on the reference of Crispus, right? That's referring back to Crispus as in the one from verse 8 in Acts 18. Make sense? So he baptizes Crispus, which was probably an important point because to have the leader of the apostles on this mission baptizing a very marquee convert, not because, when I say marquee, what I mean by that is not that in the eyes of God, this person is worth more than the other. That's not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to marquee from a temporal perspective, right? Like this was a humongous deal that the leader, it wasn't just like some pleb in the back of the synagogue. It was the leader of the synagogue that God converts to Christianity, right? That's a marquee thing. But what I also want you to notice is actually, if you cast your eyes further back up all the way to verse 1, Paul, called as an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother.
So he converted across as well.
Yeah. The Sosthenes, who was the replacement of Crispus, after he gets beaten, he actually converts to Christianity as a result.
Or they might have suspected that he was leading that way beforehand. And
Potentially, may well have. Who knows? The at least broadly speaking, the one thing that we can say is up until that beating, he was the leader of the synagogue and was the replacement. So I want you to see big picture what's going on here. You're laughing at. God converts Crispus, the leader of the synagogue. They then would have carefully appointed a new successor to basically lead this kind of theological counterinsurgency, so it were, on the part of the Jews.
Can I stop you there?
Go on, yeah.
Just expand on that because it's very important. You said Crispus had converted and the leaders of the Jews got together post haste.
Yep.
There was no time wasted.
Correct. Yeah.
And amongst the elders, a new leader of
Yep.
the synagogue of the Jews had to be appointed.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so before appointing such a man, what do you do?
Oh well, all kinds
You
of things.
interview
the
him.
whole process. But yeah, it's quite extensive actually.
So Sosthenes would have had to have said something like, along the lines of,
Yeah.
these Jewish Christians are rebels,
Heretics, the whole box and dice. Yeah. Apostates.
they're wrong,
Yep.
they're worshipping this Jesus Christ who is a false Messiah.
A false prophet, the whole box and dice. Yeah. Oh no, the way in which there is as much of a there is as much theology and ideology going on as there is politics in that kind of appointment. That's the kind of point I'm trying to make clear. The way in which that would have unfolded would have, the elders would have gathered. There would have been an extensive process of not just merely finding someone who's qualified and capable, but actually there would have been an entire strategic missional focus on this particular incident. It wouldn't just be, the previous rabbi retired or the previous leader passed away, we're now just moving on to the next guy to just continue as status quo. No, this would have been, this is the kind of appointment that would have been taken under the guise or under the premise of who among us is going to be the general, the commander who will lead us in this campaign to destroy the heretics. Do you understand? It was a militant perspective, and all you have to do is just it's not. That at that point is not what-ifism. That's actually just taking the whole flow of Acts thus far and just drawing reasonable conclusions about how these things tend to work. And so this was their guy. Do you understand? Of anyone that they would have picked, again, keep in mind Corinth had the largest Jewish population outside of Judea and Rome in all of the empire. This is a humongous. This is a humongous population. There's somewhere around, it's various numbers are given, but it's tens of thousands. It's a big number here.
What we're surmising is that Sosthenes was a Jesus Christ hater.
Would have had to have been, absolutely, 100%, ardently against in every possible sense, which is exactly why them turning on him for this failure is ironically in this great cosmic play of irony, exactly what God used to actually convert him to Christianity. These people actually do hate me, and they're on the wrong side. Those on the side of Christ are on the right side, and their violence and their absolute uncivilized barbarism, in this case, publicly, very, very publicly, basically in the town square, beating the living daylights out of the dude, was the demonstration of their anger and their evil, their bitterness, their hatred, their vile, their vitriol. Right? The same kind of vile and vitriol and bitterness that murdered Christ, that said, give us Barabbas, this rebellious murderer who's killed people, and who's completely unrepentant, completely unapologetic, and would do it again anyway. Give us him instead of the Messiah who all of our ancestors actually placed their trust in. And let the blood of this man be upon our heads and upon our children. Right. That visible display of anger and of hatred, a true visceral existential hatred, for the one who all of their ancestors that they claim to have allegiance to, David, Moses, Abraham, all of this is just simply proof positive of exactly the point that Jesus himself made, in reference to them as the synagogue of Satan, that they are of their father the devil, that they've actually abandoned God and are actually worshipping dark powers, because that kind of hatred and vitriol has even drawn them. This is their lowest point, by the way, in all of the book of Acts, right? Post crucifixion of Christ, this is their lowest point, because beating Paul within an inch of his life, evil, atrocious, but makes sense. Like it comports with what you would expect, right? They're literally trying to kill off the Christians at that point, right? That makes sense. This, though, is I would actually submit their lowest point, because they've actually turned on one of their own, and now, like, the anger that they had all pent up towards Paul and co, they now can't actually do anything with, so they've just completely reoriented it and unleashed it on their own guy.
They're unhinged.
Completely unhinged, yeah.
I'm not so sure how their system worked in those days, but some of the stuff I've seen is that they actually, one Pharisee would follow the older Pharisee as their teacher.
Yeah, there was a mentorship, yeah.
Yeah, and so there was a mentorship, and there was like a whole, what's the word?
Hierarchy?
That's the word, yeah.
Yeah.
And so Sosthenes would have been quite well...
Oh, that's my point I'm trying to make, yeah. No, he's very senior, yeah.
As the forthcoming replacement,
Yep.
if something happened.
Absolutely. Yeah, this wasn't, I'm saying, that's what the point I tried to make earlier was, he wasn't just plucked out of the air, like, as, who's going to be the, our previous leader has just passed away unexpectedly, who do we want now? No, like, this would have been, he's already upper echelon, it's succession, yeah, 100%. That's the point I'm trying to make. This is their guy. This is the guy. This is the guy who's like, this is the guy who's going to come in and who's going to take the fight to the heretics, and this is the guy who's going to lead the charge, blah, blah. And it's all absolutely, utterly failed. And this was probably his plan too, by the way. As I said earlier, it wouldn't have been singularly, but he would have been very much part of the mastermind of this plan. And then his plan, quote unquote, has failed, and then they turn on him. It's unhinged is the word. Yeah, because that's what anger does. Anger and hatred, well, anger is born out of hatred, but hatred blinds human beings to reason, it blinds us to logic, it blinds us to rationality, and it blinds us ultimately by virtue of those things to truth.
There'd be fear involved too, they just lost their leader.
Absolutely. They would probably be worried. There's already been, a good point, there would already be enough of a trepidation anyway, because, and this got pointed out in the last lesson, that the conversion of Crispus as the leader was can't be underestimated in its strategic significance. Only by virtue, not merely by virtue of, it's the leader, but that's basically like I think I gave this analogy last time just to get the point. Not that they're equal to each other, but just in terms of the philosophic or the consequential outcome. It would be like assassinating the leader. You assassinate the leader in like some military operation, it's going to have a gigantic effect, right? Shake things up greatly. Well, this is just kind of the quasi-comparative spiritual assassination. In this case, by what I mean is converting the leader of the synagogue to Christianity.
Who then went next door to...
Who then went right next door to Justus. Yeah, exactly. That's what early up in the passage, if you go back and read it.
God has a sense of humour as well.
That's why I use that term cosmic irony, yeah, because it is. But the reason why, though, is it's as a judgment. Because what the ultimate outcome of all this is that they turn on the guy who was going to lead all of this, and then as a result of them turning on him and abandoning him, and they for sure would have kicked him out in the whole box of dice, that then actually drives him to see the truth that, hold on, no, the Christians, well, they're actually correct. Hold on.
I would imagine there would still be some communication with Crispus at the same time.
Oh, for sure.
He'd been learning behind him.
Yep. He would have been, exactly. He would have been mentored by Crispus, because Crispus would have been older, obviously, or at least in that cohort. Yeah, for sure. And so it's entirely, again, this is what if, but it's entirely possible. It would comport that after this has occurred, who do you think probably came in and helped Sosthenes? The Christians, Crispus and the Christians. And so when you wonder why he converts to Christianity, that's what it is. And so what that is, by the way, just so on that reference in 1 Corinthians, Paul called us an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother. That's a common way that this occurs. Sosthenes is actually the scribe who writes this letter to the Corinthians. Okay.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Sosthenes is the scribe that Paul uses to write the letter. So the way that just so people understand, we have because we in the modern West have high rates of literacy, where people know how to read and write. The common misunderstanding about history is the fact that we forget that the vast majority of people that have ever lived have not been literate. And it's not that Paul wasn't literate, but also it's a failure to understand that historically, in ancient Greco-Roman, or in actually literally every ancient society, but in this case in ancient Greco-Roman society, orators
didn't sit down and write their own stuff, right? They spoke, and a scribe wrote it down. So the way, and that goes for Paul too. That was a common custom, not because Paul is literate, he's definitely literate, but that's just the custom. Absolutely, yeah, that's the custom, yeah. And so exactly, and so Paul, Pharisee in this case, yeah, other side, yeah, Pharisee. And so in this particular instance, like the way this would, and this goes for all of the letters. He's sitting, they would be in a room somewhere. In this case, Sosthenes, who became his scribe, would, as an educated man, make sense because he's a rabbi himself. He's educated, so on and so forth, as the leader of the synagogue. So he's literate. He can write. And Paul would be sitting there, and he would be saying, "Paul, called as an apostle of Jesus." Well, actually, that introduction would be written by Sosthenes. But here, to the church of God, which is at Corinth, to those who have been sanctified in Christ Jesus, that's Paul speaking, and Sosthenes writing. Okay, that's how that works. We know that for a fact. That doesn't impact inspiration at all, because it's not. Paul didn't have to sit down and literally write the words out for it to then be Paul writing it. No, this is Paul writing it by those cultural standards. Does that make sense? It's like how if someone gives a speech politically and then someone transcribes it. Well, no one's under any impression that the politician didn't give the speech. Of course the politician gave the speech, right? Someone's just transcribed it. That's how that works. And so, all I want to do is point out that Sosthenes then becomes his scribe and writes this letter to the Corinthians. And so Sosthenes then joins Paul and is with Paul for a considerable time. Yeah.
Gallianos is also known as Gallios.
Gallios, yeah.
Is there any historical link between? Is there any historical suggestion that Gaius, mentioned in 1 Corinthians that you just read, is this Gallianos?
Highly unlikely. There is an etymological link between those names. They're not exactly the same name, but but that would be, highly unlikely.
It'd be a very interesting.
It'd be a fascinating possibility.
If it were.
I only say the only reason why I give that reaction is because it's impossible to tell. So it'd be entirely speculative. But
because Gaius is a Roman name and Gallianos is a Greek.
Is a Greek name, yeah. And so sometimes with names they become, it's not difficult, but there just requires a bit more work, because as we've explained this, especially like some of the earlier on chapters where like name, well, they're not technically a name change, but the difference between Saul, the transition between Saul and Paul, often gets confused for like a change of name, as if he never had the name Paul, but now it was like the Jews in the Hellenistic period for the last 300 years, including up to this time period, had a Hebraic name and a Hellenistic or Greek name, and that was common for all kinds of different peoples across the empire. And so that's why you get the difference between Kephas and Petros or Peter, for example, with regards to the Apostle Peter. So sometimes with names, you've got to kind of piece things together and realise what name's actually being used at a given point. The etymological link is probably not enough to draw any definitive conclusion, yeah.
What we've seen of name changes, though, like Peter, his name was changed to Peter because it had the meaning the rock.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And Saul changed his name to Paul because it meant the least.
The least, yeah, exactly, yeah. And I'm not suggesting that there's no meaning in it. I'm just saying that there's a contextual background of name changes or even dual names are a common part of what's going on. That's all, yeah. And so there's meaning tied into the names, but there's the context of this dual naming system, which is pretty common around the empire, depending on different people groups, yeah.
Is there further historical evidence to tell us what happened to Crispus and Sosthenes?
Not that I'm aware, beyond their passing reference in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. We've made those kind of links before. Like there are other links to not here, but in church history, in our church history classes, for example, when I made a particular reference to the fact that in the first century, even prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, the gospel had gone to basically every corner of the world by that point. The gospel had already reached the Indus Valley in the east, and it had already reached Britannia in the north, under Aristobulus, who was the first missionary to the
to the Roman Britons. Aristobulus is likely the one that gets mentioned in Romans chapter 16, where there's this whole list of people that Paul is giving thanks for and blah, blah, and Aristobulus is mentioned. I forget which verse it is. But the house of Aristobulus is mentioned. That's almost certainly that Aristobulus, because Aristobulus left from the Eastern Mediterranean via Cyprus, I believe, off memory. He then was in the Church of Rome for a time to prepare and get things ready, and then launched that mission from Rome to Britannia. So hence why he gets mentioned in the end of the book of Romans. Does that make sense? Outside of those passing references, there's no other. It's not. It'll only be speculative at that point. So yeah, good question. So there's a couple of things I want to see here. I want you to see here, and again, it's a shorter passage, so it's not as long of a lesson today. But there's a couple of things I want to point out that are the main takeaways. One is the consistent effort on the part of those who are, in a functional sense, apostate Jews, those who have actually abandoned the faith of their ancestors because of their rejection of the Messiah. This is why, for example, the term church, or in the Greek ecclesia, is used even in the Old Testament in reference to the assembly or the congregation of God, his covenant people. Because at the end of the day, the functional salvific property in both Old and New Covenant is, at least at a fundamental level, the same. It's placing one's trust and faith and hope in the Messiah. And the difference, Old Covenant to New Covenant, Old Testament to New Testament, is really just the orientation of that view. One is looking forward, the other is looking back. Right? It's why, for example, many throughout church history would have rightfully referred to Abraham as a Christian in that sense. Right? He's looking forward to the Christ. His hope is in the Christ, in the Messiah. Christian in that sense. The kind of the phraseology of the Old Testament church, right, is a perfectly applicable term when understanding the term church to mean the congregation of God, or the covenant people of God, the assembly of God. The fact that the church is, on a fundamental level, just like the synagogue in that regard, the assembly, just with obviously new covenantal features to it. And so the thing that gets made very apparent even in the Gospels, but including here as well, and especially by the time you work your way through the book, especially into the chapters of note in the Revelation, is that those who have rejected Christ are apostate. They've actually abandoned the faith. They are not on the same side as David. They're not on the same side as Moses. They're not on the same side as Abraham. They're not on the same side as the prophets. They have abandoned the truth of the Torah and of the law and of the prophets for their own traditions. Even a cursory reading of the Gospels gives more than enough of a view of how much more important the oral Torah and the traditions of the Pharisaical and Sadduceical schools are to them than the kind of things that would go on in the centuries that follow this to become the basis of the Mishnah and the Talmud, which even to this day are of far greater importance, practically speaking, to those who have rejected Christ. And it drives them to once again do the same kind of thing that they've attempted to do in other cities, especially in Greece, in Greater Greece, where they have attempted to incorporate the civil magistrate into their scheme, so it were, to try and overthrow and to destroy what the Christians are saying. And that includes the resorting to of violence. In this case, the violence that they much would have liked to have actually directed at Paul and co. Gets unleashed on their own leader, who they now see as a failure and the one who they probably place a lot of hope in to lead this thing.
A traitor.
Yeah, a traitor in that sense, for failing to do all these things, and so then they beat the daylights out of him. And turn their evil and their anger and their hatred. And the point that got made, I forget what word you used. I think the uncivilized. Unhinged. That's what you said, unhinged. That really does actually get at the heart of the issue, and it's important to see that. It's important to see the kind of reaction that this is born in those who are, to use the way that this word gets used by the Apostle John in his epistles, antichrist, right? In other words, against Christ or in the place of Christ. Those who are antagonistic and hateful of him.
There would have been a certain amount of frustration that had the Romans not been there, they would have been able to carry out their scriptural law because they would have been the authority. So there would have been
There is also that too, yeah.
fire that they had to bow and tote to the Romans.
Yeah.
And what's even worse is that the Roman governor just didn't care what they did to their own. He just
No, and the ending reaction of but Gallio was not concerned with these things is kind of, for anyone who knows Roman history, is kind of to be expected, because he said no to them, and then he witnesses them just descend into the kind of behaviour you would expect from chimpanzees, a mob, and it's just kind of like, it would have been entertaining at that point, for those accustomed to the gladiatorial games at least, as he would have been, and so the whole thing is just a dumpster fire. The whole plan completely fails. But what has to then be seen in the background here is that all of this unfolded exactly as God ordained it to, exactly as God planned it to. Their plans, they schemed, they planned to do evil, not good, and their evil schemes came crumbling down in front of their very eyes. And the whole thing is an absolute dumpster fire. It's a complete failure on their part. And then just to pour a bucket or two of salt in the wound, God then uses that whole entire cacophony of a failure to then convert Sosthenes.
Would this have been public? Would there have been...
super public, absolutely.
So there would have been a lot of people who wanted to see the outcome of this all standing
up. This was super duper public, absolutely, yeah, 100%. Very, very public. That judgment seat, that's the public magistratorial seat in Corinth. There are a couple of different places that was held at different points in the history of Corinth. Where it was at this particular juncture in the Roman province of Achaia, I wouldn't be able to tell you, at least not off the top of my head. But this is all very, very public. It could have occurred near the Stoa, which is the main street of ancient Corinth, leading up to the Agora and to the athletic field on the left and the Temple of Zeus on the right. It could have occurred in front of the Temple of Zeus, which was the primary temple and religious centre down in the city of Corinth itself, other than the Temple of Aphrodite up in the Acrocorinth, which is the big mountain above Corinth. But this was all very public nonetheless.
So if you were in the crowd, you just saw that your Jewish leadership just descended into total turmoil.
Correct, yeah.
And the guy that was supposed to be dragged before them for being a heretic is just standing there.
Basically, yeah, nothing happens to him. He's not even touched.
Nothing happens to him. You might have some doubts about being, about this Christianity thing, if it's, for real or not.
In certain senses, or alternatively, it could be viewed, you're watching this all unfold, and I go top speculative, but you're watching this unfold, and the guy who'd been brought on trial, quote unquote, ends up totally fine, doesn't even have to end up saying one word, one but, one if, and the guys who were trying to go after him just descend into utter chaos. And and the guy who was supposedly going to be getting it that day is totally fine. Ends up actually testifying pretty well for Christianity, but it depends. It's what if at that point. But yeah, you got a question.
Leaving aside those political manoeuvrings, from our point of view, we know that the Holy Spirit moved mightily in this period, and a lot of souls came to salvation.
Absolutely.
And therefore, we would safely say that these are the roots of the division between the Jewish Christians,
yep,
and the
Jews, Judaism, yeah,
and Judaism.
Yep,
this is where the
apostate religion
begins.
Oh yeah, it's all these things. But again, I've pointed that out plenty of times before. But yeah, it's these kind of things that are, each one of these instances is just another tear in the fabric, and rightfully so, of the use that kind of motif, separating sheep from the goats, quote unquote, right? Wheat from chaff, blah blah. The separation of the Christians, the righteous, Jew or Gentile, because all are one in Christ. The categories obviously still logically exist, and that's fine, but in Christ all one. And then the apostates, the ones who have actually abandoned the faith. Because and this is a common point which sometimes gets missed these days, and just comes from not quite piecing the entirety of the Bible together as actually one system. The Judaism of the last 1800 years, which is basically, 1900 years post-destruction of Jerusalem, is not just simply like Christianity minus the New Testament. Okay, that's not what it is at all. It's the consolidation of the oral law, the exact kind that the Pharisees and the Sadducees continually tried to prop up, functionally speaking, above the Tanakh, above the Old Testament, that then gets codified and eventually written down nearly 150 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, by around time you get to around the year 200 AD, plus or minus, in the Mishnah and then the commentaries on all those things in the Talmud. There's a Jerusalem version and a Babylonian version. That is the functional basis of Judaism as a religion. It's the continuation of this apostasy in a codified form. Do you understand? It's not just simple, and it's not. I'm not hacking on people. It just usually just comes from not having a terrible familiarity with it. It's not just simply Christianity, but minus the New Testament. So, they just do the Old Testament stuff. No, not really, not really. Do they obviously read the Old Testament? Sure. They read portions of it that are favourable. They ignore, they don't just ignore, they outright completely outlaw places like Isaiah 53. So if you go to your average Jew, they've never read Isaiah 53 because it's illegal. It happens all the time. The amount of times I've had discussions with Jewish guys or girls my own age, in their 20s, who couldn't tell you one single word of that chapter because their own rabbis have literally barred them from reading it. It's functionally speaking not there. And there's other texts that are along those lines, but Isaiah 53 is really the most kind of hard line. There is a infinitely greater care for the Mishnah and for the Talmud, which is the Talmud being basically like the rabbinical commentaries, and it's really arguments about law and arguments about philosophy and blah, blah, blah. All the traditions that the Pharisees actually, that's what that is, functionally. And it's not just simply Christianity minus the New Testament. It's the decision to, instead of actually repent, it's the doubling down that occurs in the 2nd century. There's a whole bunch of politics and history. There's 2 additional revolts after the revolt in 66 to 70 AD. There's another later revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt. There's a third one. There's another revolt as well that ends up going about as well as the one in 70 AD did, which is not well at all. And there's a whole history tied in with that. But that's the sad and unfortunate direction that was taken. There were the Jews that became Christians because that's what it was. That's the entire point. But then there were those who had apostatized, those who had become heretics, those who had rejected all the things, the blindingly obvious things about Jesus that get said all throughout the Old Testament that just line up top to bottom, that clearly demonstrate that he was this one who had been looked forward to and had been prophesied by these people, the one who their own ancestors had placed their hope in, who they now rejected because of their own apostasy and their own evil. And so, to touch on your point you're drawing there, this is just one in another example in the line of the bifurcation, the split between what this very same Apostle Paul calls the true Israel and the false. Those who are, or even to use Jesus' own word, those who are real Jews, like Paul, those who have actually believed in the Messiah, and to use Jesus' own words, those who are false Jews. He calls them the synagogue of Satan, as in they are actually worshipping Satan, they're not worshipping Yahweh. And that's, again, the whole point about perception is, and again, none of this is meant to be a hack, it's just explaining the reality of the scenario. They don't worship Yahweh. For starters, because of the fact that Yahweh is a Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That reality is there in the Old Testament, and the New Testament reveals that, and that is ultimately rejected. Even doctrines like that were actually present during the Old Testament period, a doctrine called the two powers in heaven, which was this understanding that for some reason the Old Testament keeps referring to these two Yahwehs, or these two Lords, these two gods. It's not actually literally doing that. Like the classic example is Psalm 110, which I quote ad infinitum here in sermons usually because it's the most commonly quoted passage in the New Testament. Yahweh says to my Lord, or the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet.
So there's the Lord talking to the Lord. And it's really the Lord, as far as David's saying there, talking to my Lord. Well, who is my Lord if it's not the Lord? Well, that's an internal discussion within the Father and the Son. That's what's going on there. And
who is David? Who is the Lord from King David's perspective?
yeah, exactly.
Who is it?
Yeah, exactly. That's the whole point I'm trying to draw here. And so, yeah, exactly correct. And so, how is he able to refer to two lords in the one sentence? Or how are you able to get this pluralistic referencing of "let us make man in our image"?
Or even when Abram was sitting in his tent.
That's the next point I was about to raise. Yeah. Good. No, go for it.
Oh, well, three men walked up to him.
Exactly.
God.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, correct. He's conversing, and as we've explained, when we've had sermons where we've gone through bulks of John's prologue, for example, and this great philosophical exposition on the Logos, the Word, who is Christ incarnate. When you hear God speaking in the Old Testament, outside of certain particular isolated incidents, the whole point of the New Testament revealing is that you're actually hearing the second person, you're hearing the Son of God speak. So when you hear "let there be light," you're hearing Jesus speak. When you're hearing the one with whom Abraham debates over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, you're hearing Jesus. Right? That's the whole point. The word that you hear, again, outside of isolated examples, like, for example, in Psalm 2, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," that's the Father speaking, because that then gets quoted in the New Testament, blah, blah, or like when you get to the baptism of Jesus, "This is my son in whom I am well pleased." You actually rarely hear the Father speak. Not because he doesn't speak, but because Christ is the Logos. He is the Word.
He's the interface.
Yeah, he's the interface. He's the mediator. He is the mediator. And so when you hear God speaking, when you read of this voice of God appearing in a burning bush in a cave in Midian, in Exodus chapter 3 to Moses, you're hearing the exact same voice that came forth from the fire 1,000 years later with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Babylon. Do you understand? It's the same voice in the fire. That's the whole motif. That's the Son of God. Okay, and so why is that important? Because then the rejection of that, the rejection of him, the rejection of all of what the Old Testament characters, the people, right, Abraham, Moses, etc., all looked forward to, is the rejection of the religion of God. There is not this sense, and I know this might seem on the nose for the current geopolitical events that are occurring in the Middle East. It's not designed to be. It just happens to be the passage that we're up to. It wasn't. I didn't plan for a war to break out during this passage. But there is not. Christians kind of need to be a bit careful with how they explain things.
Or pray about Israel.
And pray about things. Not because we shouldn't pray for the end of bloodshed. That should just be. That should almost literally go without saying. But having an actual, not just a thoroughly biblical, but then also a thoroughly historical understanding of these kinds of categories. The scriptures don't present the idea, and yes, there are disagreements among Christians about this, but I'm still going to explain what I would very, very strongly teach. That it's quite plain and evident that there is not two separate peoples of God. That there are God's people in this group called the Christians, and then there's this other group of God's people called the Jews, depending on how you're wanting to define that term. Because keeping in mind that even at this point, like a significant number of the Christians are actually ethnically Jewish. So where that bifurcation comes in gets a bit tricky. Things like, for example, this exact same apostle, as he explains in, Romans chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, particularly chapters 9 and 11. There's one tree, like there's not two, he's using it symbolically, of course, but there's not two different trees. Like there's this tree called the church, and then there's this tree called Israel. That's not the image that gets presented at all. There's one single tree that is the covenant people of God.
Well, I'm laughing because there's the olive tree and the fig tree.
Oh, no, exactly, and that's the point I'm about to touch on, is that the common kind of crossing of the wires is this reference to fig tree and to olive tree, and that's a motif that especially in regards to the fig tree, it's a motif that goes all the way back to the opening chapters of Genesis. But point being,
that what's actually explained then in Romans 11 is very much what's in view is that there is one singular tree, that there are branches that have been cut off, the apostates, those who have rejected the Messiah, and there are branches that have been grafted in, those who have accepted the Messiah. There are branches also that just stayed, like the implication reading between lines, there are branches that just stayed on the tree. Do you understand? Okay, so that's Peter, that's Paul, that's the Jews who believed. Do you understand? Who did exactly what was meant to happen, which is, well, they just believe in the Messiah, just like Abraham believed in the Messiah, just like Moses, just like David, just like it's the same functional thing.
Paul says first the Jews, then the Gentiles. So it's talking about the spread of the...
Yeah, it's the spread of the gospel. Yeah, 100%. And so there are branches that just remained on. This is Paul. This is Peter. These are all branches that remain on. There are branches that get grafted in. Us, me. I'm, Anglo-Celtic, Greek, etc., etc. There are branches that got cut off, which are those who have rejected the Messiah. Sadly and tragically, but that's what they've done. But there's still the one tree. Do you understand? It's very, and this is not, the reason why I point this out is because this was very widely understood throughout church history. Like no one in the early church had this notion that there were like two different trees. There's the church and then this other thing called Israel. No one in the medieval period believed that because that there's this church and then there's this another thing called...
Where's this two trees idea coming from?
Okay, so what I'm trying to get... So the point I'm trying to reference to is that some would point to the fact that we, in our particular modern context, because there's a nation state called Israel, right in the Middle East, when we talk about the word Israel, there tends to be, depending on what particular people's theology or eschatology is, a confusion for what the biblical understanding of that term is, in light of, or really in the reverse side, against or in light of the current modern national designation of that country called Israel as well.
In the secular world, is it? Or?
That's one you have, yeah. Or in church, or in certain church circles as well. But that's all I'm referring to, yeah. And so when we talk about the word Israel biblically, that does not immediately equate and shouldn't to the current modern nation state, because those are two theologically completely different concepts. That the common... For those who hold that they're two different things, the common misconception is that someone, as people all throughout church history, for the vast majority of it, including myself, would say, is that when I say the church is Israel, it's not the sense that the church is some different organisation which replaced Israel. The church has always been Israel, and Israel has always been the church, the assembly, the congregation of God. It's always been that because there's, to use Paul's motif in Romans 11, one tree. Branches have been cut off, branches have been grafted in, branches just stayed on the tree, but there's still one tree is the point that I'm using that biblical motif. And so to conflate the term Israel in the scriptures for the current modern nation state is where things go awry, because you're not taking it biblically anymore. Now you're also trying to draw in a modern geopolitical definition that just doesn't work, is my point. And that the reason why Christians have differences of opinions about that is largely due to eschatology and other theological issues like that. But the point being that the people of God are those who have faith in the Messiah. And it usually ties back to a lack of understanding about what Judaism is. That's why, for example, I've said in sermons past that a term like Judeo-Christian, which is kind of used is really in no uncertain terms an oxymoron. Like there's no, it theologically speaking, biblically speaking, it makes no more sense than a term like Islamo-Christian would make, right? Because there is the common perception, certainly secularly, that, there's the three Abrahamic religions, quote unquote, right? There's the Jews, there's the Christians, and then there's the Muslims, as if we're all on the same team. We're not. We're not at all. We're not on the same team. Judaism is the religion that, and that's why people are usually stunned when I explain to them the history, that Judaism as a religion is younger than Christianity, right? You can only meaningfully date Judaism to the late 2nd century AD, not BC, AD, when the compilation and the actual writing down of the Mishnah and the Talmuds, well, the Talmud had been in development, but by the time it gets codified, 2nd century and onward, that's the foundation of Judaism. Okay, as a religious system. which is younger than Christianity, because again, Christianity doesn't just date to Jesus. The whole thing is Christianity. This entire thing is Christianity, right? From tit to tat, because it's not just Christianity minus the New Testament. That's not what equals Judaism. It's a whole lot more complex than that, and just generally comes from a knowledge gap. That's all. It doesn't mean you don't pray for the conversion of Jewish people. We should pray for their conversion just like we would pray for the conversion of anyone else.
Yeah, well, there's a great organisation, Jews.
For Jesus, yeah.
Yeah, for Jesus.
Yeah. Who are the branches that have remained on the tree in that case. Yeah. And God bless them. But there isn't this sense, and this is where things usually get dicey, but again, what the scriptures teach is what's most important here. There is no meaningful sense in which you can use the term, for example, like chosen people or chosen ones, for example, elect, to use the kind of New Testament Greek English wording, and apply it to those who are outside or beyond the covenant of God, right? Abraham was part of the chosen people, right? Moses, Joshua, David, blah, blah. And we, who are the continuation of that, because now the covenant people of God has expanded beyond the overwhelmingly ethnically Israelite or Hebrew people in the Old Testament, because even the term Jew comes from Judea, in other words, the southern, those of Judah. So to use the term Jew just generically in the Old Testament actually doesn't really make much sense, because there's a lot more tribes than just Judah. So Hebrews are actually a better term, the descendants of Eber or Eber, the Hebrews, or the Israelites, the descendants of Israel or Jacob, has now expanded to both Israelites, ethnic descendants of Israel, and all the Gentiles who have been grafted in. That is Israel. Israel hasn't changed its fundamental core definition other than being opened up to Gentiles now. And that's the entire premise. There's still one true. I didn't plan to have that. It's just this happened to be the kind of passage where this whole event happens, and I can't easily coordinate geopolitical contention in and around that.
That idea of Judaism being a product of the second century can't be very popular idea.
Say again, sorry?
It can't be very popular idea, the idea of Judaism being a product of the second century.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be a widely accepted.
The Jews won't acknowledge that.
Well, no, the Jews wouldn't.
Said, no.
The Jews wouldn't acknowledge what I just said. But the issue is not. But just like, for example, exactly, good point. But just like, for example, that Muslims have an extremely difficult time, and by difficult I mean impossible time, acknowledging the fact that they're just simply a Gnostic cult that broke away from Christianity. Everything they believe is Gnostic. Half the stories that Muhammad decides to try and tell in the Quran come from Gnostic Gospels, like the Proto-Evangelium of James, and other such documents get written hundreds of years. Huh?
Or worse. The satanic verses.
Yeah, or worse. Yeah, correct. That's why in the Quran you have stories like Jesus as a child forming a bird out of clay. Well, the problem is we know exactly where that comes from. That comes from a Gnostic gospel nearly 200 years after Jesus. So you can't get away with that. You could in 7th century Arabia. You can't get away with that in the 21st century, where we know what these things are, right? Well, you also couldn't get away with it in 7th century Arabia, but you can't get away with it now for sure. It's very plain and obvious that the author of the Quran, if I assume it to be Muhammad, which I don't mind doing, this contention, but let's just assume it is, through his scribes, because he was illiterate, the clearly doesn't understand who the Christians actually worship. Like the Quran very clearly presents an image that Christians worship a trinity of Jesus, the prophet, Allah, and the Mother Mary. As far as the Quran's concerned, that's who the Christians are worshipping. No one has ever done that. There's been exactly 0 people in the history of Christianity, even the most heretical people. There's no heretics that even did that. Like it's such a complete misunderstanding. Of
course, they get quite offended because they believe there's only one God, and how dare we worship 3 gods?
Yeah, well, they're also under the impression that exactly they can't get around. Because they don't have any kind of philosophical notion of a trinity philosophically, and they flat out reject it because they're Gnostic. They also then are Unitarian, so one God in one person, like we are, and they just can't wrap their heads around it. But again, it's because they're a Gnostic cult, and that's all they ever were. Right? So it's that the whole point of that's what I said about the Judeo-Christian thing. You'll never hear me use that term because it doesn't make sense, and in fact, it's not just simply like a misnomer. It's actually like seriously wrong. It doesn't help either the Judeo or the Christian side of that little moniker.
Jews these days are basically, it's ancestral. You basically...
It's entirely ancestral, yeah.
And, well, it ties back to how they viewed their, like Jesus was in the line of David. And so they continue on that ancestral... There's
a definite ancestral line, and Islam's the same thing too. Islam is often postulated as the fastest growing religion if you fail to take into account the fact that their growth is like almost entirely because of birth rate, not conversion. Islam is a religion you're born into in almost in like 90+% of the time. It's an ancestral thing, yeah, and so that's why you still have, if you went to the modern to the current Israeli state today, like the overwhelming majority of them are atheists or agnostics generally. Right? They're not even practicing the 1800-year-old religion of Judaism. Largely.
I called one guy aside and said, "Tell me all about your festivals. I need to know all of them."
He wouldn't.
And he goes, "No, you need to talk to my rabbi."
No, you talk to the rabbi. He's not going to know. And it's not meant to be an insight. I'm just speaking. It's nothing emotional. It's just explaining the facts as they stand. Is that these kinds of terms? The problem is it comes from a lack of understanding of Judaism, mainly because it's a pretty insular thing anyway, because it's tied to the family ancestral component. So there's a very tight link between the religious and the ethnic aspect in most settings, and so it's very insular, it's very endogenous, and so outsiders, quote unquote, getting an understanding can often be a bit difficult unless it's studied academically, but having a lack of knowledge doesn't help how we then evangelize. We're not on the same team, just like we're not on the same team with the Muslims, and we're not on the same team with the Buddhists, we're not on the same team with the atheists. We're not. And that's okay. It's sad, but it's okay, because if we treat people like they're on the same team, quote unquote, I'm just using that term for simplicity's sake, you're not helping them by showing them their need, absolute, desperate, existential need, to convert to the worship of Christ for the sake of their soul, right? Not because we hate them, but because we actually care about them and love them. It doesn't help to pretend that we're actually you're good where you are. We're on the same team because we're fighting against whatever we happen to be thinking we're fighting against. We need to have a bit of a better, because historically, a lot of the positions in modern evangelicalism, particularly, are not the kind of view that Christians have had historically, especially taken from the scriptures. I'll leave it at that. So that ends the lesson. So normally what we do is we then open up to question time if anyone has any questions. Usually people don't, which is fine, because most of the questions get asked as it goes through, which is fine. That's how it keeps the flow a lot easier, and it helps people to, instead of forgetting the questions by the time we get to the end. But does anyone have any final questions or anything else about this morning's passage? Cool. All right.
Hang on a minute. Isn't this where your question, Jan, comes in? Isn't it hot on the heels of Israel? The talk about Israel?
Well, we can open up to that question time now, but I'll finish this thing. I'll finish it first, and then we can.
I do have a point to make
on that passage.
Yes.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Studying Acts, as we have been doing for the last few months, has been a fascinating journey for me, because though I've read Acts how many times I don't know, I just failed previously to realise how concentrated and dense this book is. It's an amazingly dense book.
I recall saying that all the way at the beginning. I said people don't often. You'll see. I said when I explained at the very beginning, we'll be in this for probably 2 or 3 years roughly. Yeah. I said that, and everyone got like deer in the headlights, because like, oh, he's going to go for 3 years. And it's like, no, but you don't realise how much we can unpack this.
It has so much spiritual relevance for us today as believers.
Sure.
But it also has wide-ranging relevance, significance, politically speaking.
Yep.
Because let's take Sosthenes, for example.
Yep.
The Jews had set all their hopes on this one man. And if we look around the history of mankind since Jesus' ascension to heaven, we see mankind putting all their hopes in a certain one man from time to time to time. And that spirit is back. over the last 2 or 3 years, I've noticed, especially in the USA, the whole population putting their hopes on one person, one man, only to be let down.
No, not Jesus. Yeah.
Only to be let down. And the lesson here is that when you turn your back on God, you must replace God with something.
Always has to be a replacement. Always, yeah. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, nature abhors a vacuum. Yeah.
The Jews turned their back on God in this epoch that we're studying, and they suddenly put their hopes into Sosthenes, who let them down.
In that local context,
the click of a finger, he let them down.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
And we are, in my humble view, progressing towards a period where pretty much the entire global population will be putting their faith in one man, only to be let down by that man.
Then we open the question of eschatology, but
That reflects on Sunday's sermon as well, when you're talking about what are you venerating?
what are you venerating? Yeah, when we talked about that, yeah, we were talking in the context of veneration and the previous 2 weeks in our sermons we were covering. Yeah, I was giving a very, very introductory 2 sermons on a kind of a biblical theological understanding of Christian art and such things, and how are we to use them? What's the distinction between an image and an idol? Because we're going through, like we are here, we're going through an expositional series on Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 4 is where Moses starts talking about idolatry. And then the weekend that you were just referring to on Sunday was more about how we to use, what are the uses of artwork for things like aesthetic purposes or didactic or teaching purposes, and then where's the line of what should Christians be doing with regards to venerating, say, for example, iconographic veneration, and those kind of contexts. Yeah, look, I'll only make one quick point on that with regard to the American scenario. I've said for quite a while that people need to be very vigilant to avoid getting caught up in a cycle of pendulum swinging. Okay, what I mean by that is, you mentioned American politics. That's an archetypical example in our modern world, especially in the West, of the pendulum swings between, let's just take the US presidents of the last 30 years. Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump, Biden. It's the pendulum swing, do you understand? Irrespective of political opinions, that scenario only ever spells doom for a nation because it's always spelled doom for a nation. Do you understand? That level of political involatility is disastrous and literally catastrophic. The alternativization, this is part of the problem, is that when you are actually facing genuine corruption, like which so evidently and obviously exists in the American political sphere, and Australia too, no, exactly. Corruption's everywhere, exactly. The problem is to then look to a singular individual to try and fix the scenario. It shows a distinct lack of history, particularly of a particular republic that then transitioned into an empire that I'm thinking of that happened to go by the name of Roman, which is
the Nazis was the same pendulum again. So.
Yeah, same pendulum. The pendulum of post Franco-Prussian War, post Austrian-Prussian War, which then builds through the time of Otto von Bismarck and the King Emperor. Yep. You then have the embarrassment of World War One, and the whole host of things goes on in World War One. But you then have the embarrassment of being annihilated in World War One, especially at the Treaty of Versailles. You're a laughingstock. You then descend into this absolute calamitous train wreck called the Weimar Republic, and then pendulum swing, and then you arrive in the 1940s Germany. Okay. Those things are very, very dangerous, and that come about as a result. Well, they cause political instability, and they result in political instability, and all these kinds of things. And so, yeah, it's very, very dangerous. And that this is one little microcosmic example of them turning to one guy, and it's all failed for them. But it did so according to the absolute plan and sovereignty of God, for the conversion of people, including Sosthenes himself. So I'll end it there, and then I'll answer the question that was had. Yeah.
Can I just make one comment about the density of Acts? When you first read it, you could relabel it as the adventures of the apostles, really.
Yeah, in many ways, yeah. The adventures, yeah, is a good way of putting it. Yeah, it's a journey. It's journey upon journey. It's a good way of phrasing it. Yeah. It's very much adventurous, which is why you see this this polar zooming kind of action literarily on Luke's part. Zoom out, zoom in. Zoom out, zoom in. Every great story, fictional, non-fictional, or otherwise, does the exact same thing. When you're watching a great movie, it zooms out to the broader detail, sometimes in case literally with like giant panning scenes, and then zooms in on a particular scene where the characters are talking, and then it zooms back out, and then they're traveling to such and such, that's... it's just extremely brilliant literary composition on the part of Luke, who was a historian and a physician, to then weave this entire story over the course of decades all together in a readable fashion. Yeah, exactly. So, thank you.